Welcome, quiet soul. You always hear what others miss. Today you are the listener history has been waiting for. You might have thought the arena was a place people came to watch others die, but the truth is it wasn't. The arena was where you took your seat and began to wonder whether you were the spectator or the substitute. In that place, each row was measured not by the price of a ticket, but by the distance from the blade. And sometimes, the blade didn't drop onto the sand, it rose cutting upward through the thunder of applause and lodged itself into the chest of the stillest soul. In the heart of 1st century BCE Rome, where every road led to spectacle and self-glorification, there came an afternoon when the line between celebration and terror, between performance and waking nightmare, was smudged beyond recognition. That day, Pompey the Great, one of the 3 pillars of Rome's republican power, staged a performance he believed would carve his name into the marble of history, with 10 fingers thrown wide to pry open the gates of reverence and awe. 20 elephants, not beasts in tiny wooden cages, but living war machines of flesh and memory with hides that refused obedience and minds that would not forget, were driven straight into the centre of the circus. Maximus, the oval-shaped arena that gaped open like a sacred mouth ready to swallow the crowd's collective soul. From the 4 corners of the grounds, hunters emerged, men from North Africa, bearing the scars of desert suns on their backs, and the indifference to blood in their eyes, hurling spears at the elephants with a rhythm steady as the beat of a war drum. Tens of thousands of spectators packed the stone steps like grains of rice scattered on a massive platter, screaming not just from thrill, but from the hunger stored in their bellies, the bruises of being ruled, and the dreams they could never live outside this place of blood and sand. At first, the elephants merely endured, but when blood began to pour down their legs, when the spears pierced the thick skin that could no longer silence their cries, they ceased being performers. They became creatures clawing their way out of a script written in cruelty. They hurled themselves against the iron barrier, a fence once believed to hold back the madness of wild beasts, only to reveal itself as nothing more than a cold metallic structure before the desperate weight of an intelligent creature driven to the brink. The fence didn't collapse, but it trembled like a joint straining to pop from its socket, and the spectators who just moments ago revelled in bloodlust shifted in an instant to primal panic, where screaming was no longer a form of expression, but a plea for deliverance. The massacre was halted barely. The hunters, once mere instruments of the spectacle, suddenly became Rome's last line of defence, circling the elephants from behind, driving their spears into backs slick with blood again and again, until the sand held nothing but twitching masses of flesh and hollow stares gazing up at the unyielding stone steps. And from that day forward, a truth unwritten in any official chronicle carved itself into the city's collective memory. The front row was never again just a place to watch. It became a place to survive or to die faster. That event, though it did not happen in the Colosseum, was a blood-soaked prophecy of what Rome's greatest arena would later inherit and perfect the architecture of separation as power. The Colosseum was not merely a colossal structure of stone. It was a machine engineered to stratify society by sight, by seating, and by the distance to death. The closer you sat to the blood, the closer you were to glory, and the more likely you were to become the next stain on the sand. People often ask, the closer the seat to the arena, the higher the price, right? In ancient Rome that was true, but what you bought wasn't just a view. You bought the privilege of witnessing death from closer than anyone else. You bought a ticket to the edge of hell, where one misstep, one flicker of flame or claw could leap across the line. When you entered the Colosseum, you weren't simply stepping into a theatre of games, you were stepping into an hourglass where the sand beneath was made of blood, and the stairways were carved from stone, and the belief that whoever sat closest to death held dominion over it. And indeed, each seat in the Colosseum was not just a place to rest, but a declaration etched into geography, into elevation, into proximity to blade and fang. At the very top, where the sun scorched the scalp, and the wind carried not fragrance but only dust, and whispers, sat those who had never and would never earn the right to choose where they belonged, women's slaves and the souls permanently carved out of Rome's privileges. There were no seats, only narrow planks of wood so thin that if you breathed wrong they creaked like the grinding teeth of a death dream. A young woman stood curled over herself, arms wrapped around her child eyes, refusing to meet the sand below where blood would soon erupt in bursts. Beside her, a former slave stood still, gaze hollow, as though he wasn't watching the game but calculating how he'd react when the first scream tore through the air. Just beneath them, on slippery, narrow stone benches, was the domain of the common Roman citizen. Not rich, not powerful, but Roman enough to be admitted. Here the audience was packed as tight as minnows, flailing in a drained basin. Each time someone tried to pass, you had to pull your knees in, twist your body, clutch your water jar, and pray not to be shoved into the rage of a butcher whose favourite tiger had just lost a fight. But then just a few steps lower and everything changed. The air turned cooler. The seats, no longer bare stone, became polished slabs of marble wide with backrests, armrests of ebony or carved ivory. This was the realm of the equestrian class merchants, bankers, lawyers, those who held not official power, but the arteries of Rome's economy in their fists. They didn't clap. They sipped chilled wine from crystal flasks, watching the matches the way a man might watch fluctuations in the grain market. And then you descended to the bottom, to the podium. It wasn't a seat. It was a reverse stage where those seated were also being watched by tens of thousands of eyes above. Here, Roman senators and elite officials did not sit in public rows. They brought their own chairs, curved woodbacks like archers' bows, cushions of royal purple or golden velvet, the colours of sovereignty and slaughter. Some even had their family crests engraved onto the chair backs as if to declare, even if blood splashes up to my feet, honour cannot be scrubbed away. They were served sliced fruit, wild honey, and cakes made from millet imported from the African provinces, and they sat so close they could smell the sweat of the gladiators, so close they could see blood spurt upward, like the frantic strokes of a mad painter across the burning canvas of sand. But for that privilege they were also the first to fall if the barrier gave way. They were the wall of flesh between the beasts and the empire. Rome, in all its strangeness, always placed power right next to peril, and that was never a mistake. It was design. Because only when you sat close enough to death could others believe you held mastery over it. But could the barriers they built of stone, of iron, of ivory, and threads of golden mesh ever truly restrain fury when both beast and man were capable of losing their minds? Now we begin to peel back the layers of Rome's safeguards and pose a question more critical than any shield. If it takes guards, nets, and archers to keep death at bay, then are you really watching the game? Or are you already inside it? When you sit in the front row of the Colosseum, right on the edge of the arena floor where a splash of blood could stain the hem of your toga, where each roar from below could make the wine tremble in your cup, you begin to understand that there exists a weapon more vital than any sword on the battlefield, the barrier. Just ahead of you, no farther than a single leap, stands a thick white wall of travertine 13 feet tall, smooth as a mirror, cold as Roman law, placed there not just to hold back the beasts, but to remind every soul seated behind it that their survival depended on things already built, already enforced, already scripted. Atop that wall, real ivory tusks, curved, polished, and whiter than the teeth of any marble god, were fixed in perfect alignment, not to stab but to uphold something invisible, a golden net strung around the arena like a colossal spiderweb, not strong enough to stop the leap of a tiger, but sufficient to calm the anxious hearts of politicians pretending serenity on velvet seats. Just beneath the glinting mesh ran a line of ivory rollers engineered so that any four-legged creature that dared to climb would instantly slip, as though even nature itself, no matter how fierce, was forced to halt at the brink of power. But if Rome had truly believed that stone, ivory and gold were enough to protect itself, then it would never have stationed a line of guards armed with short spears, wooden shields, and eyes locked in a state of permanent tension, patrolling the corridor that ran just behind the wall throughout every performance, not to watch but to wait, not to enjoy but to be ready for the moment something leapt beyond the bounds of the script. Behind them, hidden within the passages veiled by towering columns of stone, stood the Roman archers, shadow-like figures as still as statues, fingers poised on taut bowstrings, eyes fixed unblinking on the sand below, waiting not for enemies but for anything that strayed from the choreography, a tiger veering the wrong way, a gladiator misstepping a spectator sitting in the wrong seat, a breeze disrupting the arc of a blood spray. No one saw them, but they saw everything, and in the Colosseum to see first was to earn the right to kill first. In a place where every movement, from the tilt of a gladiator's head to the precise moment when orange blossom mist was released from the walls, was pre-programmed by ritual and unwritten law, any disruption in rhythm was an assault on the empire's very existence. And so the wall wasn't merely a wall, it was the threshold between theatre and threat, between the right to witness blood and the duty to spill it if the illusion began to crumble. More terrifying still, according to scattered records and whispered accounts buried in forgotten scrolls, was that the archers didn't always fire to save, they fired to silence. A gladiator slipping past his mark, a beast veering toward the elite, or worse, a dissenting shout from the crowd, could prompt an arrow to leave its bow sink clean into a throat, and later be recorded as an unfortunate accident during rehearsal, which is why the most important wall in the Colosseum was not the one made of stone, nor the golden net, nor the line of armed guards, but the invisible wall that ran between the eye and the truth between calm, carefully directed and chaos buried alive between what the people were allowed to see and all that they were forbidden to know. Step beyond the fence, beyond the wall, beyond the illusion of control, and only then can you stare into what Rome could never truly contain. The collapse, the trampling chaos, the grandstands cracking like ribs beneath the weight of panic and blood, flowing freely in a silence that no longer earned applause. Not every death in the arena came from claw or blade or the orchestrated rage of beasts unleashed for spectacle. Some arrived before a single drop of blood was spilled, before the horns signalled battle, and sometimes they didn't rise from the sand at all, but rained down from above from the very crowd that came to watch. In the year 27 CE, in the small town of Fidenae not far from Rome, a temporary amphitheatre was thrown together in haste to host a show of unprecedented scale, not because Fidenae was worthy, but because the blood-soaked spectacles within Rome had been restricted, and the organisers, desperate to satisfy the thirst of the masses, needed a stage, any stage. The bleachers were wooden, the supports poorly calculated, and on that afternoon, when thousands had crammed into every corner, figs still on their lips scrambling for seats, the western section of the stands began to tremble, not with applause, but like a soul that sensed its own ending drawing near. In under 10 seconds, more than 20,000 people were crushed beneath the very structure they believed would hold them. Not a single beast involved, not a gladiator in sight, only the quiet miscalculation of a timber beam and the weight of trust betrayed. And when the wood stopped groaning, what remained was not silence, but the screams of bodies locked within one another, bones tangled in straw, and cloth, blood mixing with torn sleeves and half-eaten crusts of bread, as Rome, the empire of architects and engineers, stood by while 20,000 vanished beneath a stage built on pride and shortcuts. There was no memorial, no registry of names, just a single line in the writings of Suetonius, as if the entire catastrophe were nothing more than a minor inconvenience in the uninterrupted march of Roman glory. But those who survived or lost someone they could never bring back remembered, because the pain of a nameless death always lingers longer than one that is shouted into legend. At the Pompey Amphitheatre, nestled in the very heart of the capital, there was once a riot not sparked by beasts but by the crowd itself. It began on a sweltering afternoon when two groups of young men from rival neighbourhoods, each already harbouring old grudges, happened to choose seats far too close to one another. All it took was a mocking word, a misthrown grapeskin, and what began with muttered insults escalated with fists, stones, blades and blood. That day's performance dissolved into chaos as spectators turned on one another, painting the marble benches red with the blood of dozens who came to be entertained, but died where they sat. Not long after, in the same venue's backstage corridors, a starving leopard broke free from its cage and mauled an artist to death. And in the slums nearby, whispers began to spread about an Indian python that had been devouring children for 3 weeks straight, though no one dared confirm it aloud. These deaths, of course, were never recorded in Rome's official history, because Rome only remembered what served its glory. Everything else was swallowed. The next tale begins with a knight and equestrian named Rufus, who dreamt of his own death, and yet the very next morning rose without hesitation, dressed with care, and made his way to sit in the exact same seat he had seen in his dream, as if he intended to face fate with the same heartbeat it had warned him to protect. Because not every death announces itself with screaming blood or the glint of steel. Some arrive quietly, like a dream so precise it leaves no cut but tightens slowly around the soul, and that is why such deaths linger longer than any wound. Valerius Maximus, the recorder of strange and terrifying things, once wrote of Rufus, a Roman knight not wealthy enough to be untouchable, but known enough to earn a seat in the Colosseum's front row, where every position was defined not only by status and fame, but by the ability to pretend you were immune to consequence. One night, whether rain fell or wind blew, no one knows, because history does not preserve weather, only aftermath. He dreamt of himself sitting there in his usual toga, his hands resting exactly where they always did, on the carved stone arms depicting lions mid-pounce, his gaze locked onto the arena floor. And standing opposite him just beyond the bloodless sand was a stranger in gladiator's armour. There was no sand, no blood. Only a strange slanted light falling from a corner he couldn't quite see, casting the gladiator's face into shadow, while making the sword shimmer not with gold but with cold. The figure did not approach him, did not raise the blade in some rehearsed gesture of showmanship. He simply stood and waited, as if Rufus were the one summoned to the duel, and the moment he exhaled would be the cue for fate to seal its script. And at that exact instant, within the dream, the blade pierced straight into his chest, not missing by even half a finger's width, a strike so precise, so quiet, that even pain felt redundant. Rufus awoke with cold sweat clinging to his neck, not because of the nightmare itself, but because the warm ache in his chest still pulsed beneath his ribs, as if the dream had not ended, only paused, awaiting its second act in daylight. His servant begged him to stay home. His friends laughed it off, then traded glances behind his back. Even the old house slave, long forbidden to speak freely lightly, grasped the hem of his tunic and repeated in a trembling whisper, "There are dreams that are not meant to be forgotten, but listened to." And yet Rufus stepped outside, not in defiance, not in haste, but with the calm gait of a man who no longer had a choice, only a need to confirm whether fear had taken form. When he arrived at the Colosseum, the crowd was as loud as ever, the stone seats scorching beneath the sun, the stairwells cracked from time and footfall, the air thick with the smell of wine, spiced with fennel children yelling blades, slicing fruit, and the chaos of ordinary joy so vivid that when he finally sat in his usual place, he didn't feel awake, only as if he were continuing a scene already written. Two gladiators were led in, walking between daylight and the scrutiny of thousands of eyes, but only one pair watched them, not as fighters but as shadows being studied, searching for the shape of something already seen. The duel began. Sweat fell. Blades flashed. One collapsed. The other rose and then with eerie stillness looked upward, not searching, not signalling, but as if he had been standing there since the night before, waiting patiently for this exact moment to complete the ritual that destiny had begun. No barrier could stop the will that had been planted in a dream. He raised his sword not to celebrate victory but to bring waiting to an end, and with a single, flawless thrust he struck upward toward the stands, piercing through distance, through the collective gasp of the crowd, through the shimmering net that was never meant to be breached, and drove the blade straight into Rufus's heart, as if the sword had always belonged there long before the man himself had even been born. In the official record, Rufus was listed as a casualty of an unfortunate incident during the performance. But in the minds of those who were present that day, and in the chests of all who have ever dreamed of blood, they knew it was never the dream that killed him. It simply led him to the place where the blade had always been waiting. And now we turn away from omens and dreams toward a different kind of power, one that does not need a sword or a spear or even blood on its hands, because in Rome a single glance, a raised eyebrow, could cast a man from the seat of honour into the dust, where the dogs were already waiting. In the Colosseum no one sat closer to the blood than the emperors, and no one stood farther from punishment, even if they commanded death in plain view, under the open sky amid applause fragrance of cinnamon mist from hidden fountains and eyes that never dared look back at them directly. At the podium opposite the altar of the gods stood the royal box, a place reserved for one, the only man allowed to sit higher than all of Rome, the only one permitted not to clap, not to smile, not to bow to anyone. He, whether Caesar Tiberius Caligula or Domitian, sat like a living statue, his eyes never needing to rise because every other pair had already lowered before his gaze could arrive. In a society where blood was spilled in daylight, where men were butchered for sport and wild beasts trained to roar on cue, true power had no need to draw blood because the emperor's silence, his stare, his stillness already did the killing. They say Domitian the emperor, who breathed suspicion and ruled through silence, once sat motionless for 2 full hours, his eyes fixed on a young man seated in the front row, a man foolish or brave enough to mutter that the matches seemed rigged. When the performance ended, that man was never seen leaving through the nobleman's gate. Instead, he was quietly pulled aside and escorted down a different corridor, one whose doors did not lead to freedom but to sand and dogs. At the next show, the seat remained, but no one took it, not because of law, but because something had been pulled out of the air itself, something vital, something alive. A century later, during the reign of Commodus, the emperor who fancied himself the reincarnation of Hercules, there were whispers that a group of comic actors was ordered to reenact the myth of Hercules slaying the Stymphalian birds. But instead of aiming their arrows toward the sky, they were permitted to aim at the audience. No one knows if it truly happened. No record survives. As if the collective memory of Rome had been wiped clean with a single stroke of deliberate silence. Only those who lived through it or sat there that day told what little remained. Not every show is for entertainment. Sometimes it's a test of loyalty, with your body as the answer. And when a man seated near the emperor no longer knows when to laugh, when to stop clapping, when to lower his head, that is when he understands that his life no longer belongs to him, but to a glance that hasn't yet arrived. Because the most terrifying thing in the Colosseum was never the roar of the beasts, but the moment you realised you'd been noticed. Not by any ordinary look, but by a gaze that required no words, no gesture, no guards, only time, just long enough for your heart to fracture beneath your own ribs. And perhaps that is why so many among the noble class carried small flasks of perfume with them, not to mask the scent of blood, but to conceal the odour of fear of decay, of that slow rot which absolute power always brings even before it chooses to strike. Now we return to the sand, that sacred floor where everything seemed choreographed to perfection, only to remember that death has never cared for scripts. We begin to see what happens when the crowd revolts, when the gladiators stop acting and start surviving, when blood spills out of rhythm and the Colosseum carved in stone, and legend begins to fracture from the inside out. There is a question the ancient Romans, beggars and senators alike, never dared to ask aloud when they stepped through the gates of the arena. Did they come to watch, or to be watched? They took their seats, figs splitting in their hands, wine swirling in their cups, but deep within something always curled tight, that sensation of sitting at the edge of a world where death kept no calendar. A beast could slip its cue. A blade could strike the wrong direction. A column could snap from one careless nail. And the emperor could change his mind with nothing more than a furrowed brow. Anything could flip a person from spectator to sacrifice. That's why the knights who lived to tell about the shows rarely spoke of the battles, but of the wind. A breeze that drifted across the golden net, rippled the surface of a wine glass and made the man beside you flinch. Because for a split second he thought it was a leopard's leap. There is no certainty here. And no one, no matter how noble, how distant, how well prepared, can ever say for sure that today isn't the day their name becomes part of a rumour. One afternoon you might simply be lifting your sleeve to block the sun, and suddenly recall that once an emperor named Caligula, suffering from heat stroke, granted the senators permission to wear hats during the games. It seemed a kindness, but in truth it was an unspoken confession. Even the highest were not safe from sun, from blood, and from the very spectacle they believed they controlled. Because in the Colosseum, death did not only stand upon the sand, he could sit behind you, to your left, directly across. He wore a toga, he bore a golden ring, and sometimes he was the one who signalled the match to begin. The Colosseum was a performance staged to perfection, lit to catch every perfect angle timed like ritual. But it was also a colossal box, a trembling container of faith and violence, where even the most tightly fastened order could collapse from a single unseen crack, a place where one mistimed drop of blood could send the entire empire into convulsion. Are you watching, or are you waiting for the blade? Perhaps no one can tell the difference anymore, not since the moment the seats of honour began to carry the scent of rusted iron and artificial perfume. Because when it takes stone walls, golden nets, archers and guards just to keep the spectators safe, you have to ask yourself, are you still watching the game, or have you already become part of it? There are deaths that are etched into stone, sung into epic ballads, painted in blood across palace walls, immortalised as proof of a glory the Empire wants the world to remember forever. And then there are deaths that leave behind nothing but a dry salt trace on the surface of a stone bench, a cold bead of sweat dripping onto a sandal, or the slight tilt of a head of someone who saw everything but knew that if they spoke, their name would vanish like blood pressed beneath the weight of sand. The Colosseum was never a place that counted how many died. It only kept track of how many came to watch and how many never left. There is no ledger for the souls crushed beneath a collapsing stand. No historian recorded the final scream of the young woman trampled beneath the panicked crowd. No statue was ever carved for the children hunted by an escaped python in the back alleys behind the arena's backstage. Rome only recorded what served its glory. The rest, the dried blood, the nameless pain, was left for the stone to remember. The slippery stairs, the deep gouges in the seats clawed by fingernails gripping too hard, the dark corners where guards once dragged someone away and returned alone. If there is a place on earth where people would willingly sit closer to death than anyone else just to stare into it as if it were a masterpiece, it is the front row of the Colosseum. You sit there, your hands resting on lion-carved armrests, your eyes fixed on the sand, freshly dampened, so the blood won't seep too fast, your ears catching the growl of beasts behind the iron gates, and your nose filled with the scent of orange blossom, sprayed from hidden nozzles in the walls meant to mask the coming stench of ruptured flesh. Every sense is indulged except your heart, which tightens each time the horns blare, because you know that a single misstep, a leopard breaching the barrier, a gladiator missing his mark, or simply a glance from the emperor at the wrong moment, could turn your privilege into a death sentence. No sword raised, no verdict spoken. The front row is not just a seat. It is an examination, a ritual offering. There the velvet cushion cannot soothe the subtle shiver in your spine. The silver goblet of wine cannot mask the scent of rust rising from the weapons below. And the family crest carved into the back of your chair cannot deflect the gaze of death himself, the only spectator who always sits behind you and never looks away. When the show ends, when the crowd disperses, when the guards lower their spears, when the gates swing closed, when all the cheers and drums dissolve into stone, only one sound remains, a sound no one wants to hear, but the Colosseum never forgets. The faint slide of a cold blade across the edge of a stone seat. A sound not loud enough to alarm, but sharp enough to etch itself into the memory of anyone who ever sat too close to the truth. You may walk out of the arena, but if you have ever sat in the front row, it will live inside you forever, and for the rest of your life, no matter where you are, no matter what sounds surround you. Each time someone mentions glory or applause or triumph, your heart will pull inward, because you know some things are so beautiful they can only exist at the edge of hell.